Good evening, Tucson. You're watching Creative Tucson, Channel 20, and this is Goodnight Goodhart, Tucson's freshest picked local talk show with your favorite host, Luc Rollin Goodhart. That's me. It's Wednesday, May 9th, and we're coming to you live from the Creative Tucson studio in downtown Tucson. Thanks for tuning in. I am so thrilled about our two guests today. We have two distinguished scholars in the studio, both of whom have recently published books in their fields, and we are lucky enough to get to pick their brains. First, we have Eric Plemons. Eric is a medical anthropologist and core faculty member of the U of A's Transgender Studies Initiative, where he specializes in researching theories of sex and gender, especially and most recently in relation to surgical practices in trans medicine. We also have Joanne Stuhr, who is an art historian and independent curator. Joanne works with museums and private collections in the US, Europe, and Mexico, and specializes in folk art of Latin America and pre-Columbian antiquities. Eric, Joanne, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, how are you doing? So I always like to ask, what'd you guys do today?
I finished the last of my grading for the semester.
Excellent.
So yeah, and
job.
started doing
Winding
some
down.
writing projects and met with some students. It was a pretty ordinary day today.
Great.
Yeah.
I have
Joanne?
the Pre-Columbian specialist from Christie's Paris here visiting, so we've been traveling around to museums and collections and talking Pre-Columbian art all day.
Very nice. Well, you've just been living it.
Yeah, yeah,
Awesome.
we're there.
Very good. So I just want to get some background on both of you. How did you arrive at kind of the career that you're in now, your individual practices? Eric, let's start with you. How did you sort of start on into the field of medical anthropology?
Well, after I finished my undergrad degree, I moved back to Portland, where I'm from, and I was working at a drop-in center for queer youth, and just listening to their representation of their own sort of lives and what it was like to be a trans and queer kid that was a little bit younger than me, but not a whole lot younger, and really realizing how different their experiences were. And as a kind of a bookish person, I thought, surely I can go to the bookstore, I could go to Powell's, right, the greatest bookstore in the country, and read all about these things that I'm seeing and better understand these sort of like theorizations or ways of thinking gender and transgender. But it turns out those books were not there. And so I decided I wanted to make them. And so I went back to graduate school and found anthropology as a way of asking the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask, a sort of a deep commitment to being with people over a long period of time before you can say anything about them, and that really appeals to me, that you have to spend time with people for a long time. And so I got interested in trans medicine because we don't know very much about it. And anthropologists love a conflict and a controversy, and we've been fighting about transgender medicine since it's been a thing. So in the 1950s, when we started doing these procedures, ever since then there's been a fight about who should do it, whether anybody should do it, who should pay for it, what should happen, whether or not changing bodies and identities is something that can happen or should happen. But most of the kind of critical research on the topic has looked at the processes by which people get access to these procedures. So how do doctors and institutions decide who should get to find themselves in the operating room in the first place? But what I became interested in is what happens next. What are clinicians actually doing in the name of sex and gender changing medicine? How do you identify what those places are in the body and how do you change them? So I became interested in working with surgeons mostly, this really small network of experts to figure out how they do what they're doing. So that's most of what my practice is being in surgical and clinical spaces with these folks, figuring out the kind of expertise and knowledge they need to do their work, and then talking with patients who either would like to undergo these procedures, have undergone these procedures, and all the kind of institutional formations that happen to make that possible.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And Joanne, what about yourself? How did you come to art history and talk a little bit about what it is the work that you do now?
Sure, okay. So it's funny, Eric and I were talking earlier about how we might set out on one path and then kind of veer to a different direction. So I studied art history, studio art and art history in undergraduate and graduate school, with a focus on modern and contemporary art. But then I started working at a museum that had a Pre-Columbian collection, and I just became fascinated by the materials. So in many ways I'm self-taught in that area, and there are a lot of resources available, but I was always looking for a book, similar to what you were saying also, that explained the artifacts in a cultural context, and what their use is, and what their significance is, what their meaning is, what the cultural philosophy is from which they grow. So that's been kind of my fascination, and I hope it is for other people as well. I'm not an archaeologist. I really come to it from the objects themselves, and then understand the culture through the objects. So it's been fun to do that. And what I'm doing now, I worked in museums for many years, a variety of museums, including the Tucson Museum of Art here in Tucson, obviously, and now I manage private art collections. A few here in Tucson, one in Chicago, and then I work with another collection that's partly in Europe and partly in Washington, D.C., and I do freelance work with museums kind of all over the place as well.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm curious what does your work actually look like? What does a typical day of a medical anthropologist look like? What does a curator do on a daily basis? What are the nuts and bolts of kind of how your practice works? Eric?
Well, I have the professor hat, which has its whole set of teaching and service kinds of obligations. But when I'm actually doing my research, I'm an ethnographer. So as I said before, that means really spending time with people, doing the things that they would be doing, and trying to be as inobtrusive as possible in that process. But because I work with clinicians mostly and professionals, I spend a lot of time in hospitals when I'm doing my research, or in surgical clinic. And a lot of what that is just spending time paying attention to the little things that people take for granted in their everyday, and making those the center of attention. So one of the things that we say as anthropologists that we do is we try to make the familiar strange. So how do you focus so much on mundane details that they become something that you can think critically about as having a history, as having a politics. So I do that, but as a very capacious discipline, I do a lot of reading in history. I read law. Right now I'm working on a project about insurance, so I'm reading in the, very exciting realm of insurance history and how it all works, because those are the things that really structure how healthcare actually functions, right? So when you get down to it, as I said before, if you want to ask not only what is the concept of sex and gender such that medicine can change it, but how in practical sense does that actually happen? What are the kinds of silly appointments you have to make, and the kinds of forms you have to fill out, and the kinds of people who are responsible for those really big life-changing decisions as part of their bureaucratic day. Because in those details, that's where you find where the meaning happens, right? Where where people's actual futures unfold. And so I, as an anthropologist, try to do that kind of work, the hanging out in the mundane, just to sort of see where events happen. So where that happens in field work kind of depends on the project and can change all the time, which is really nice.
And then you mentioned that you're a professor. You're one of the core faculty members in the Transgender Studies Initiative at the U of A. What if you could talk a little bit about that project? It's kind of a unique program.
It is. In fact, it's really exciting, actually. So the initiative started at the University of Arizona, and Susan Stryker, who's a professor in the Gender and Women's Studies department there, was really the driver of that in terms of finding the institutional funds and resources to go out and hire a bunch of faculty, myself included, who have a research expertise in trans studies. But one of the things we're doing in the process of institutionalizing that is figuring out what trans studies is. Because the stuff that we're doing, other institutions are looking at and paying attention to and saying, oh, they have this whole group of faculty doing trans studies. Our students are asking for that kind of stuff, which a lot of the drive is coming from students.
Well, like you said before, it's so new. There's no roadmap as to how this is supposed to work. So
exactly.
It sounds like this initiative is kind of leading that in a lot of ways.
In many ways, and a lot of that is being reflected in Transgender Studies Quarterly, TSQ, which is a journal that's now housed at the U of A. And one of the things that you can see if you're interested in what trans studies is if you go and look at these the kind of massive breadth of material that's included in the tables of contents of this journal, that in fact, lots of people across many fields are doing work on trans folks, trans histories, using these theories that are emerging from this research, but it hasn't really had an institutional home. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the U of A. And it's great. And you know, institutions are big and they're difficult, and it takes a while to get things in place. But one thing that's been exciting is for me as a researcher and a scholar to have colleagues who I can have engaged conversations with, which it doesn't happen in this subspecialty very often. But we're also really attracting students, graduate students who want to work in a number of fields, and undergraduate students, because a lot of the interest and the momentum and energy is coming from students saying, these are issues that we care about, and we want them as part of our education. And so it's fun to be a part of building that program.
Yeah, that's something that Susan Stryker brought up. She gave a talk with another trans artist at MoCA several weeks ago, and I can't remember exactly what the question, someone in the audience during the Q&A asked a question, and it was kind of like, we don't have answers to that.
Yeah.
We're actually working on that right now, and a lot of this is coming from the students up,
right,
which is really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the ethos of a trans analytic, if you can call it that, is kind of agitating against the idea of a discipline, right? So the idea is not to say we have a discipline with a particular set of things that we do, and this is what trans studies is, because trans studies or the trans analytic is meant always to overflow its boundaries and to kind of push against that. So it's more, how can we get a group of like-minded folks together who are interested in collaborating in a conversation to develop new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of questions that bring trans folks into the center of analyses rather than using us as a stepping stool to get to something else. So it's fun. It's been a challenge.
That's amazing. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
And Joanne, what about yourself? What does your practice look like? What is a typical day? Is there a typical day for an independent curator such as yourself?
That's the question. Every day is new, which is something that I love about my work, because I'm never bored. There's always some new challenge. Sometimes it's a good one, sometimes not so good. And every day is fresh. I'm learning all the time. I have opportunities to read and study all the time, so it's great. When I'm working with private collectors, I usually start with a full inventory of their collection, and trying especially to determine the history of the ownership history in particular of the pieces that they have in their collection, which ultimately will be important to them. And then when I'm working with museums, and then with the collectors, it depends upon what they need beyond that. Sometimes we're placing pieces in museum exhibitions. Sometimes we're creating museum exhibitions entirely from the collection. We are moving things from house to house. It can be very mundane, really, in that respect, whatever the collector needs. With museums, I'm usually curating an exhibition, so it begins with the concept and then building upon that and finding the art to go with it. Or if it starts with a particular collection, then we look at the strengths and weaknesses of the collection and look where we can make something that's interesting and contributes to the field in some way, is new in some way. You worked with me for 5 years.
I know, I'm sitting, full disclosure, before I was lured away by the bright studio lights of Creative Tucson, I worked for Joanne for many years. So I'm sitting here nodding like, oh.
Yeah, right, and I'm telling you what we do. You know as well as I.
But
so
yeah,
what can you add to that? What else have we done?
Oh my God, so many different things. I mean, moving thousands of pounds worth of bronze sculpture into a well in a museum, sitting in the cab of a semi-truck from Tampa, Florida to Tucson, Arizona, with a collection trailing behind us. Yeah.
And then a lot of writing. I've done a lot of writing, in particular about various collections or aspects of collections, and research, certainly. A lot of editing. We did a lot of editing. That was always fun. What's the perfect word for this?
Exactly. So speaking of writing and editing, you both have recently published, which is really exciting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book, Eric? Your new book is called The Look of a Woman: Facial Feminization Surgery and the Aims of Trans medicine. Tell us a little bit about how that book came to be and what it's all about.
Yeah, so we were just talking before, as Joanne mentioned, and she had asked where this project came from, and it was sort of a happy accident. I had planned to do some research on genital reconstructive surgical practice in the context of Argentina for a series of interesting reasons, but personal demands kept me somewhere close to home, and I was living in the Bay Area at the time in graduate school. And it so happened that a friend of mine introduced me to a doctor, a craniofacial surgeon in San Francisco, who had decades before pioneered the practice of facial feminization surgery, FFS, which is a set of bone and soft tissue reconstructive procedures to make trans women have a more feminine facial appearance. And I didn't really know anything about the topic, but I had spent a lot of time researching trans medicine and surgical practice, and so I went and met with him, and I was completely compelled by him as a person. He's a very kind of animated, outgoing, kind of gregarious guy, but also just the general promise of the procedure itself, which is that through this, upwards of 11 hours, depending on what you're getting, surgical intervention, that something as fundamental as how people perceive your sex can be changed. And so I got very interested in that. So I ended up spending a year in his office and the office of another plastic surgeon, working with them and working with their patients and prospective patients about what it is that this procedure, how this procedure aims to do the thing that it does. And at the heart of it are questions like, what does a woman look like? What forms of knowledge and authority can claim to know the answer to that question? And then as a scholar, I also have to put that into conversation with existing other questions that people have been asking. So I'm not just a reporter just telling a particular kind of story, but I have to kind of ask a broader set of questions. And so it ended up, the argument of the book is that as ideas change about what sex and gender are, so do the interventions that are required to change them somehow, and the logic of medicine that aims to do it. So the claim that animates FFS is that, or the way that people often explain it would be to say, you don't walk down the street looking in everyone's pants before you decide what sex they are. You look at their face, right? And this is a reality that we all know, that social sex is not a catalog of reproductive anatomy. And so often we get this sort of explanation, here's what sex is, it's about penises and vaginas, except our experiences of people are not formed in relation to those body parts. Instead, they're formed in relation to things that we can see. And so for these trans women who I've talked about, who oftentimes, media depictions of trans surgery is completely genital focused, right? You can remember when Caitlyn Jenner was in the news and people kept asking, did she have the operation? Well, we all knew what they were talking about, right? When in fact these trans women would say, I may or may not ever have genital surgery, but what will change my life today is what I look like when I walk down the street, how people see me. And so I wanted to take that claim seriously and think about the politics of that claim in relation to trans community and feminist claims about what womanhood is like, and also to think about the medicine and technical aspects that make that possible. So that's what the book does through spending time in clinic and with these patients.
Fascinating. So you, the process of writing the book, was this, based on a mix of existing research and then original research that you were doing in these clinics, or what was the process of putting the book together from that?
With the exception of one person who had written a chapter on this particular practice, I'm the first social scientist to ever write about this practice.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of the research is mine. It's, figuring out sort of the history that goes back into dealing with archaeology and dentistry and all of these very particular histories that are actually a part of craniofacial surgery. So I was reading in the areas of the library that I never thought I would visit, which is great. It's always a nice surprise.
It is.
And so in terms of the practice itself, that was all original work. But then putting into conversation with, as I said, sort of feminist and queer theories of embodiment, trans history, the history of trans medicine, that was existing research. But the ethnography and the FFS content itself was all original research.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
And seems like your book has been pretty well received. You won an award for this book, the Association for Queer Anthropology awarded you the 2017 Ruth Benedict Prize winner. So that must be really exciting.
I was really thrilled because, I mean, one always is happy to win prizes, right? That's always very nice. But especially because this is a group of the Association for Queer Anthropology, which I'm a member of, but also it really feels to me like it was the group of my peers whose reading of the book would be seen in all the ways that I wanted it to be. And so to be recognized by that group was really,
really
very
special.
It really was, yeah. I was really thrilled to have gotten that.
That's amazing. Well, congratulations
Thank you.
on that.
Thank you very much.
And Joanne, let's talk about your book. It also has a fairly long academic title.
You have to take a deep breath. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Traveling with Cortez and Pizarro, Discovering Fine Pre-Columbian Art, a curator's and collector's journey through the Stewart Handler collection. Tell us about this book.
That is the title. Well, I'm a bit curious about it myself because I haven't seen a copy yet. I'll be receiving one in a couple of weeks. I'm really looking forward to that.
You must be freaking out wanting to see it.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I've seen, of course, I've seen all the text.
Sure.
I've seen the photographs, but I haven't seen it put together. So it's being printed right now in Milan and on its way, or it's been printed and it's on its way to the US, and I should have a copy in a couple of weeks. So I'm really pleased about that.
That's really exciting. Of course, I helped out a little bit with some of the editing and research, so I'm really stoked to see it too.
Yes.
So talk us through about the Stewart Handler collection and kind of what were you writing about?
Sure. So this is obviously, based on the name, a look at a particular collection. So the idea was that we would take the notion of Europeans coming to the New World and encountering these cultures that were so unfamiliar to them and what they might have thought and how they might have viewed, in particular, the artifacts that they encountered. So Hugh Thompson, who's a travel writer and a specialist in Peru, wrote the introductory essay where he was looking at specifically Cortez and the conquistadors in Mesoamerica, Mexico, Central America, and so on, and at Pizarro coming into Peru. So I started from that standpoint. I was writing descriptions of each of the objects in the collection. And as I look at other books about collections, there are identifications of the piece, the name of the culture, the dates, the size, the material that it's made from, and so on, but nothing more than that. And then I always want something more substantive. I want to know why. Why make it in this shape? Why make it looking like this? What was the purpose of it? So that's really what I set out to do, and it was wonderful to have that opportunity. So with each piece in the collection, and there are about 160 pieces, I've given that kind of background. And I hope understanding. So it was great opportunity for me too to be able to do this. Really enjoyed it. And then, there's a certain amount we can assume based on what Cortez himself wrote. Pizarro was illiterate, and most of the people traveling with him were also. He had a nephew who wrote a few letters back to Spain and kept some journals, but really nothing beyond that. Whereas Cortez was quite literate and wrote quite a bit, and he also had priests in particular traveling with him who were chronicling the events, including the not so cheery events, some of the abuses and really hideous acts that were enacted on the indigenous populations. So those are wonderful documents to be able to draw from. A lot of cultural information comes from that. Of course, it's tainted a little bit by the Eurocentric view,
Sure.
It's hard not to. So recent scholarship has shed new light on some of that and had a more sympathetic and broad view of interpretations of pieces. So that's been helpful to include that in the understanding too of these materials.
Very interesting. Now, is this your first book, both of you? Have you published previously?
This is my first book. I've only ever written articles and smaller pieces, but yeah, first book.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So how does the process, how did this process differ from, say, publishing a scholarly article? Was it just in scope that was the difference? Did you discover anything different about the process in writing this than previous publications?
Yeah, I mean, so this was adapted from research from my dissertation, but you know, separate from an academic article, you have a very particular audience in mind, right? Most academics' work is hidden behind paywalls, so it's only people who are in libraries and other institutions that can see much of the work. Where a book like this, what I hope is that while it's certainly relevant and speaks to a lot of scholarship, I hope that it's accessible to a broader audience, and that puts a burden on me as the writer to make sure that I write it in a way that invites readers. Nobody will read a book that they are bored by, and so you have to craft it in such a way that there's some sort of compelling arc. Whereas your dissertation, your advisors have to read that; it's their job.
Captive audience.
You know, right, exactly. But you know, not many people would pick up and read through that document. So it's a matter of trying to craft kind of a narrative arc, and also to cut out the stuff that you don't need, put that in the footnotes so people can find it if they want, but really to tell a compelling story. And I think, so I enjoyed that part of it, but it also was really difficult to kind of switch gears and write in a way that wanted to invite a broader audience in.
Sure.
So it was a challenge. I say for every page that actually is in here, there are 3 pages I wrote that I can't use. But that's the process. You know, you write and discard and keep going.
Absolutely.
Was there anything in particular that you learned, anything that kind of stands out that you discovered in researching this, or that was particularly interesting, or were there any surprises in writing this?
I don't know about surprises. I mean, I find research as a practice always, you know, revelatory and exciting.
Sure.
So, you know, even the silly things that I learned about the history of orthodontia, which I thought was kind of boring, are actually really cool. And so, but that's, you know, that's why you become an academic, because you think that things like that are cool. So I found a lot of that stuff really compelling. But I mean, honestly, the time that I spend in conversation with people is the most engaging time. When you know, for myself to be invited into a clinical space when a person may have saved for 20 years enough money to be in that room, to get that exam, to undergo a procedure that they feel sure is going to radically change their life, the privilege that they offer to invite me into that space to share that moment with them and then to talk with them is a profoundly generous thing. And to be able to share in those conversations and learn from people is a really unique thing that there's no kind of library time that can take that up, which is a reason why I'm an anthropologist, not a historian. You know, there's that living engagement that you can't replace with anything else.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And Joanne, what about you? Is this your first publication?
It's not. I've written probably 15 exhibition catalogs, and then a couple of other, 3 or 4 other major books like this. This will be about 400 pages, so yeah, longer.
And was there anything different or new that you discovered in the process with writing this book, or you know, same kind of question? Was there anything particularly interesting or surprising that you learned in the course of the research?
Not necessarily surprises, but a deepening of knowledge about the cultures that I was studying and that I have been studying, and the opportunity to really focus on particular small aspects sometimes of cultural production and of the philosophies that really created these cultures.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. So we were talking a little bit before, and you know, your practices seem very different on the surface, but there's sort of some interesting crossover in. I mean, you were talking a little bit, Eric, about how this field of trans studies is something very new, but this idea of gender performance and body modification is not at all new. I mean, we find records of this in art history, in archaeology. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So Well, information in my field comes from three sources, and one is the objects themselves, the cultural objects, the artifacts. One is colonial records, as I mentioned earlier, and one is archaeological research. And sort of, you know, our understanding of human existence, right? So many of the figures, many of the objects that were made in pre-Columbian Americas are human figures, right? And so from these we can see what the ideals of beauty were. And there was a tremendous amount of body modification and different ways of beautifying the body, certainly tattooing, scarification, sort of raised cicatrices, and body painting, piercing, as we see now, ears, septum, lower lip, and I guess it's called gauging now, the large, yeah, certainly that began with Pre-Columbian, in the Pre-Columbian Americas.
Ear spools.
Ear spools, definitely, and huge labrets, pieces that hang from the septum and actually cover the nose. Very elaborate silver and gold work, sometimes inlaid with stone. Tooth shaping, filing, sometimes cut into a step fret motif or inlaid with turquoise or jadeite or gold. Tooth coloration with bitumen, so the blackening of the teeth. And this was done for men and women as a sort of cultural affiliation and a designation of status. Cranial modification was practiced, widespread, and of course there is archaeological evidence of that. And different shapes, so that was done from birth to about 2 years when the skull becomes ossified, with manipulation, massage, binding, and certain kinds of compression. It was done mostly by women who were trained in the field, widespread through Mesoamerica, but the form of the head was different in different areas. In western Mexico, it tended to be a higher domed head. In the northeast, it was sort of a flattened head. And in the Mayan area, of course, we know that classic Maya profile with a sort of sloping forehead and the nose the bridge of the nose that extends from the middle of the forehead to the tip of the nose. So the skull would be modified accordingly. And in addition to that, so the sort of highest ideal among the Maya was Lord Pakal, who was the ruler of the big site in Honduras, which I can't remember the name of right now. Anyway, so he had that classic nose. So they would insert rubber. Rubber is a New World substance, latex from a vine, into the bridge of the nose to sort of raise it out.
Oh, interesting. So it was actually an implant. Yep. That's fascinating.
Yep.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and what's not known is whether it was inserted as a liquid and then it was solidified, or if it was solidified first and then inserted, because you can't tell once it's solidified. Tattooing was what, most skin deteriorates. So there's not a lot of evidence of tattooing. It's obvious, or it seems obvious from the artifacts that was practiced, and also from the colonial records. But recently, about 10 years ago, this body was exhumed of a woman, a very high status woman, really significant in a lot of ways. She's holding an authority staff that's really unusual for women. Of course, most men are archaeologists, or were, so they always said no women were in authority positions. Obviously, this is not true, but she was heavily tattooed and her skin is intact.
Oh, wow.
It's absolutely amazing. Wow. She has spiders and crabs and insects all over her body. It's really so fantastic. Yeah. So and then gold jewelry to match. And then in this site where she was found are murals that represent some of these same imagery.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So, Eric, I mean, your focus is mostly on more contemporary surgical practices, but I imagine that in your practice you do engage, or to talk about more ancient practices.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, all this stuff that you're talking about, these great elaborations, I mean, the body is the first surface that we have for encountering the world, and so, of course, it is an object on which we do a lot of work. And I think, we can talk about the kind of stuff I work on as being very contemporary, but it's the great sin of history is to imagine when you just found out about something, it's because it just started. So we have these people who do these modifications to their bodies. Well, history tells us across multiple kinds of knowledge sources that people have always done that thing. There's no kind of body that's not a modified body, because we begin shaping the bodies of our infants and literally shaping them or changing them through access to nutrition or different movement practices and all of these things. So yeah, I mean, we can talk about modern medicine as being cutting edge and brand new, but we've been modifying bodies and replacing body parts.
Had bodies.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And
so
the idea that we intervene in bodily surfaces in order to change status is a very ancient practice. So we can say that now trans surgery is new because we're changing sex and gender status, but circumcision changes sex and gender status. Right. All kinds of different interventions that we use, whether it's on sexed body parts or not, that are meant to signal something about the person who is the subject of that body. So yeah, there's a lot of continuity in that practice if you think about it broadly.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, Joanne, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for being with us today. Where can your book's not even quite released yet.
It's not quite released. It's published by Abrams and distributed through Yale University.
Okay.
And it's available on Amazon.
Okay, excellent. And that is called Traveling with Cortez and Pizarro, Discovering Fine Pre-Columbian Art, a Curator's and Collector's Journey Through the Stewart Handler Collection. And Eric, your book is out. It is available.
Out.
We have a copy of it right here. The Look of a Woman.
Please go ahead.
Facial Feminization Surgery and the Aims of Trans Medicine.
Yes, it's published by Duke University Press, so you can get it at the university site or any online retailer. Try to use a local small one if you can.
Yeah, I hated saying that on Amazon. Sorry.
You've been watching Goodnight Goodhart on Creative Tucson Channel 20. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to my guests for being here, and stay creative, Tucson.